So I'm Chris. I'm not from here, although when I'm in London, people think I am. I don't know why. I'm actually from Scotland, although you probably wouldn't have guessed that either. I'm also very aware that I am a UX person at a developer conference. I thought it might be an interesting change of pace for myself, speaking in front of developers. Let's see how that goes. So I work at the Guardian newspaper. We're based in London, England. And I work in a department called digital development. So at the Guardian, we set this up about 2-3 years ago, and it was all about us moving with the times, so putting together a strong developer stack for how we're able to publish stuff really quickly, but also at the same time being able to understand what our content actually means in the digital news space. So a little bit about me. So almost over the last decade, I've been working in some pretty content-heavy setups. So I've designed the mobile experience for Yahoo Answers, which obviously there's a lot of user-generated content. I currently work at The Guardian on the mobile and devices team. It's a very fancy name for apps. And that obviously comes with it a lot of editorial content that we're publishing daily, a lot of content. In the evenings, I teach UX at General Assembly, sort of helping the students to discover ways of thinking in terms of UX and design, and also help them to discover the importance of content and how to sort of work towards their content into their designs. For those of you who don't know, General Assembly is a great teaching startup. It's now pretty much a fully fledged institution. There's about 14 campuses around the world. Awesome place. I definitely recommend it for UX, for development, for design, for all kinds of stuff. What else before I get started? Oh, my Twitter handle in the corner. Full disclosure, I did not know who Mr. was. And honestly, it was mostly because when I was at uni, I was illustrating, and everyone was calling themselves Mr. something. And I had no good ideas, so I called myself Mr. Complete accident, no relation to the musician. Yeah. Although he hasn't picked me up on it, so it's all good. So I'm going to talk to you today about content, about time, and about change. To be a little bit more succinct, I'm going to talk about perspective. All nice, small topics to get into in an hour, obviously. So changes, or sort of talk about the content in how to think about your users and how they're consuming that content. I think about how you think differently about your users themselves, and how potentially how to design for a different perspective than designing for the time that they want to spend. So I'm going to talk about designing for users' time. I'll talk about how to display that content for a time. Hopefully, this might not be just a Guardian thing. Some of you might be working in content. You might be in a difficult position where you're looking to just optimize your content. I want to challenge you guys to think differently about how you're putting that content out there. And this thinking for us was really difficult, and it really pushed us. But ultimately, it gave us a really different and interesting perspective that we could then apply to our content and help take it forward. So hopefully, there'll be some elements in here of interest. I know, as I said, this is a developer conference. So hopefully, it's just trying to get you thinking a little bit differently about certain things. It doesn't necessarily have to be a content, but it could be something like that. So at the beginning of 2015, Guardian went through a pretty big change with their website. We went fully responsive. And this was about 3 years from conception to being fully launched. And we changed pretty much everything inside the building. We made our own CMS, which could then publish all of our content to all of the different platforms, and I mean all the different platforms we have. I will highlight just a few of them, but we are just trying to get our content out everywhere. We redid our tools, so everything was published through a single platform. It was important for us to move with the times, and that's pretty much what we tried to do. So a really big change was in how we presented our content. So the shift in digital news into the sort of responsive web that we have now. Obviously, there's a lot of changes in technology that has enabled that. And with that comes questions around grid, space, image sizes, fonts, things that touch on development. Obviously, we did a big changes to our homepage, which potentially is a contentious thing. A lot of people I know say that the homepage is dead. A lot of people just go to articles. We obviously have our third-party platforms to deal with. And then there's big questions around how we cope with that editorial voice. So we've gone from an editorial floor that had to deal with publishing to a newspaper and possibly to one website. Now all of a sudden we're talking about platforms. We're talking newspapers sit to the side now. We think of platforms, we think of apps. We think of all different types of where the content might live. So there's all this added stuff now the editorial teams have to think of. So how do we cope with that voice and keep it consistent? This is for demonstration purposes only. This is not a real graph that I grabbed from anywhere. So where people are reading their content has changed, and it's changed quite rapidly and quite dramatically. We've already had this moment, that cross-section. That's already happened for us. More people are coming to our site from mobile than they're coming from anywhere else. So it brings up some interesting questions around sort of desire, immediacy for speed, and updates. And of course, our content, again, isn't just in one place anymore. It's lots of little chunks that sit across the whole web experience. And the last big change have been the people themselves. So the context of content and news has changed. What are people doing? Why are they coming to us? What are they looking for from a news experience? I'm going to reference a couple of people in the talk. One of them is John Setson. I hope I've said that right. He's the creative director at Media Temple. And he talks about designing for the 24-hour experience. I definitely recommend you look at that talk and have a look. I'm also going to reference a guy called Paul Adams, who is the VP of Product, I hope, at Intercom. And he talks about a technique to design for people called jobs to be done. I'm going to go into more detail about jobs to be done, but I highly recommend, especially if you're all developers, some of you might be product, some of you might be design, go and look at Paul Adams. He is a really, really smart guy, and he really knows his stuff. And Paul Adams talks about, in his talk, think about people problems, not personas. So people are on all the time now, and they want their content all the time. They're pushing their own content. And due to devices and orgs, the news organization itself has now become this 24-hour, always-on platform. We can't just live in a newspaper and have our stuff published, ready to go out for the newspaper the next day. You can't live like that and continue to survive as a sort of ongoing publication. So contrary to what you might think, I'm not going to talk exclusively about responsive web. I am just going to reference it. And I'm going to reference it in the way that it made ultimately big changes towards how we think about our content. So it's the outcomes in the change rather than the change itself. So I'm going to talk about 3 different things. First is the Guardian's responsive design, and sort of the challenges that came up with it, and how we came up with a concept or a plan on how to sort of deal with our content across all these different devices. I'm going to talk about the resulting impact in those changes, which we helpfully packaged together in something called information density. And finally, how we came out the other side using jobs to be done and thinking about our people differently. I'm going to start each one of these sections in detail, and I'm going to put up a challenging statement which might divide the room. Some people might agree, some people just might not care, but hopefully be a bit of fun. So first up, responsive web is not a silver bullet for content. If you're just making sure that your content fits on all different screen sizes, you are just optimizing your content, which might be fine, but that doesn't really confirm or not whether or not people actually want the content that way on that device. I know we always say make sure all the content is fitting on all the different devices, but does it always come in the same way? Do people always have the same needs? Are all those needs being met? Yeah, they might read this content on different devices. They might expect the same experience, but do they read it in the same way? This next slide. This was just to demonstrate. We're going to take a little step back in time to 2012. This is in no way a representation of any of the screens that are coming up. But if we take a step back to 2012, obviously there was the Summer Olympics in London. Obama got re-elected, and of course there was the mine apocalypse. You all remember that? Yeah? It was good, wasn't it? The whole world was destroyed. So this is The Guardian in 2012. We had a completely separate mobile and desktop sites. And this was a really inefficient way for us to operate. So everything had to be built twice, from one to the other. Everything had to be published twice. The layout was quite static, even though things were changing quite a lot. People really couldn't tell when things were changing. It was quite susceptible to fall over when high volumes of traffic came in. Interestingly, in 2012, when Obama was re-elected, the site famously fell over, and we did not have a decent 404 page to help. So this is not really a good place to be. But we weren't the only news organization in this situation. Pretty much every other major news org was, they had either two sites or they had a separate app. They were publishing different ways. We were in contact with most of them talking about what they were thinking of, how they were going to get around this problem of whether they were going to go responsive, full responsive. New York Times were kind of thinking that. LA Times were definitely thinking that, and the BBC were definitely thinking that. So it was always long to publish. It was messy. So we needed to come up with a solution. Thing was, a year before we were even thinking about doing anything like putting all these things together, the Boston Globe was already on its way. So this marked one of the first major traffic, crucially high content heavy websites to start going through the motions of putting together a responsive website. I'm assuming most people know or have heard of the Boston Globe in some sort of way. Okay. Obviously, you know Ethan Marcotte, who was a lead consultant on this project. He obviously went on to literally write the book about responsive web design. But it really paved the way for everybody else to start thinking in this space. Was it worth high content, heavy websites going this way? Well, the Boston Globe kind of proved that it should be on its way. So in 2012, this is exactly where we were. We were publishing a newspaper, then a desktop, then a mobile site, in that order from left to right. In 2013, we created a separate beta site. So we were publishing to the newspaper still, then we were publishing to our desktop. Then we were also publishing to a beta desktop, a beta tablet, and a mobile tablet. Beta mobile. So then in 2015, we could do this. So all of our editorial staff were no longer publishing first to the newspaper, we were publishing last. As I was talking about before, that big shift in the graph, a majority of our content was coming mobile first. So we had to start writing, not just optimizing our content, but writing our content for that platform. Then, of course, we've got a Watch app. There's Facebook Instant. There's Apple News. there's a lot of places that our content lives, and a lot of places we have to sort of look at that content and make sure it reads in some way useful to the user. What about the content itself? We talk about sort of optimizing this content for all these different platforms. How does the content sit? Does the content match up to people's expectations on certain devices? Does it actually read well? Does it fulfill the editorial will they want it to have? Should we be thinking, possibly, content first, not mobile first? Lots of questions. When it comes to how much content we actually produce, on average, we're producing 400 separate pieces of content a day. On big news days, for instance, like yesterday, anywhere from upwards of 600. General election, we probably go 650, even 7. There's a massive pressure to show all of this content to everyone. We've got all these editorial staff writing all this stuff, so they want it to be seen. So we need a way to house all this content in a responsive way, and we needed some way for it to be promoted, easily discoverable. When you think about a newspaper, you think, oh, that's easy. Layout already exists, right? Well, yes, but this is editorially driven. So there's placement and size of articles. It all provides semantic meaning. You can tell the primary, the secondary, the tertiary tiers of content. There's content in the design choices. Content leads which pieces have more or less design, so to speak. So how do we do the same thing for the web? Well, we start off with a tool that is controlled by editorial. So all the content that they publish comes in the left, and they can choose predetermined layouts on the right. They decide how their content is actually going to live on the web. What does that content look like? We get into questions around layouts, around grids, something that's visually strong. Certain stories have more gravity and stand out more. So we went a bit around the houses at this point. We really, really wanted to have something that would scale and allow us to have that editorial importance at the same time. We talked to a number of different design agencies or design consultants. And we finally came across or met information architects. So if you guys are familiar with those two or three or four of them, they created an IA writer, this guy called Oliver Reichenstein. And they came up with this concept with us called the container model. And it is basically 100% width blocks that sit across our site, and they are independent of layout. So it's content first, layout second. We make sure that the content sings in these individual blocks, and then we start thinking about the layout. A really rough, rudimentary version of a container containing 7 stories. And the container could be made up of a number of different slices. Normally it was 2 or 3. And each slice would be made up of a number of stories, either between 2 and 4 normally. And even with all those constraints that we started to put in place, we actually got an awful lot of variety in terms of our layouts. So we could have single items at the top, really rich pieces of content, something that could have a bit more impact or less impact. And then, really roughly, you could just start to stack these things like real containers on top of each other. And you could determine, with the editorial staff, the layout of the page. Seems like a good start so far, right? This is my boss, Nick Haley. He's the director of UX at The Guardian. And he gave me a great quote. It was a couple of years ago, and I definitely kept it. We moved away from thinking about specific pages on the site and how they might be filled with content. So we get away from thinking of pages and each individual section of the site being a bum fight of importance. And we start to think of blocks, and those blocks have content in them. And those blocks then sing whatever the content needs to be. That's what we needed to do. So news and responsive web, especially high content, is going to be very, very hard to do. And I ran the risk of just optimizing our content. So we created this model where importance becomes like a lower thing. It's more about the content itself. And we could scale that up from mobile. This felt like something that we could be able to start, running with. And it was going to make, most crucially, it started to make our internal stakeholders and general teams really happy. Felt like we were moving, like progressing forward. Things were going right. What about external people? Because at this point, I've talked a lot about the business logic. We've put together a design logic. Problem is, if that content doesn't actually work for the user, it doesn't matter how good our logic is. That could all go out the window. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean squat. So we had the start of a solution for displaying the content free of importance. And we had to validate at this point. We needed to make sure that our container model was actually going to be something that worked. So, again, it's just illustrative purposes. There's the only one I could find of a container model on our going bad. So we had several links on our beta website, obviously trying to obtain as much feedback as we could. And this is a time when we just launched our mobile site. And our mobile site, the responsive mobile site, was the only mobile site that everybody saw. And the 2 desktops we had running concurrently. So the container model solution itself, through the feedback, we started to learn, even though it was a good solution for the content, it picked up and sort of kicked up a bigger problem with the rest of the site. Our content was getting too big. So our images were too big, the text was too big, the layouts were starting to get too big. People would start quoting us things like it had a Fisher-Price feel or Duplo. I don't think you guys have Duplo. You got Lego, right? Like, it wasn't Lego, it was Duplo, big stupid blocks. People were sort of saying, it feels childlike. It just doesn't make any sense. I don't get it. In a lot of ways, they weren't kidding. So these are within probably a week of each other. These sites are running concurrently. This one does feel a lot sparser. Feels like there's a lot less information that people are getting. And it's easy to see. We're going from columns to rows. That 100% width block was starting to sort of scupper us a little bit. Visually, it doesn't look like you can see as much. And in reality, you can't. But more than that, we suddenly shifted away, with these containers being 100% width, of having this sort of mixture of news and non-news. On the beta site at that time, we just had news. And so people suddenly were feeling like they couldn't just scan the page for all the useful information they wanted to see. But this is the early stages of 2014, so let's cool off a bit. Let's go back a step. So yes, they feel like, users, they couldn't see as much of the same amount of information in a single viewport as the current site. But we're an agile team. We've got an amazing design team. Let's just go through the motions, maybe a couple of sprints. We're obviously employing a lot of continuous delivery at The Guardian and the website especially. We can fix this. So that's exactly what we did. We started to go into design. We started to look at what we were doing, and let's optimize that design. So you start to see suddenly we've got bigger images, higher impact stories. We've changed the header. Didn't change a thing. Feedback was the same. Okay. Let's keep going. So this is a few weeks later. Sorry, a month later, where we completely changed the headline. At the same time, we were doing a newspaper. So we did the fonts, we did the stories, we added in sub-stories, connecting stories. Feedback was the same. But you can see the progression is getting there, right? We're going through the motions. We're making progress. This is from a talk that I was at in September called Agile on the Beach in Cornwall. And I ran into this guy, this fascinating guy called Woody Zwill. And he talks about this, this idea in Agile when you're basically, it's the same as in product. Sometimes when you just need to make the thing you need to make, you just have to start going through the process. And you'll start to see how it works. And then you'll really start to see what you really need to make. This is massively paraphrased, this quote. But I think that works really well in terms of development. I think that it's still something that design needs to get a better grasp on. I think too often where we could be in a moment where we need to take this big step back. I don't want to say go back to the universe, but often I hear a lot, in design speak, we need to do this design thinking. We need to go away almost into a room and think about it. So I think that there's a time and a place for design to be in that moment, but sometimes you do actually need to take a step out of the process and go, look, what is it we're doing? Why is it going wrong? And how do we fix that? And it's a lot harder when you get into design sometimes to admit to each other that something's gone wrong. And we were going round and round and round in circles in this agile process. And we needed to admit, when we were making mistakes. Failure is a culture. Yeah, everybody wants to do that. But sometimes it's really hard to actually admit to each other when it's gone wrong. You can hurt people's feelings. I know, we've done it. We really upset people when we were like, this concept, as an idea, it works, but we need to radically rethink how we're designing it. So we had this solid concept in the container model, but we were stabbing at this large problem from really far away with a tiny stick. In some respects, we were just optimizing the content we had from the original desktop all the way down to mobile and back up again. We needed to drastically rethink and take a much deeper dive from a higher board into the problem. We needed to better understand our readers. So my third point, we started to think about the time people were spending consuming our content rather than the design itself. So content nowadays is mostly on your phone, or it's more likely to be on your phone. But people have been reading, scanning, consuming content on everything forever, from newspapers all the way up to today where we're on our phones, on our watches, on our Google Glass, whatever future technology enables us to read content. We're still consuming content. And at The Guardian, now that we're attempting to be a global audience, we're reaching so many more people, so we can see that appetite on this huge scale. And people's appetite is insatiable. So we don't want to think about just optimizing the content anymore, or the layout. We want to think about the time they're expecting to spend on the site, and how we design for that time. So just to demonstrate the difference, this is in Hong Kong. This is in 2004 during the July 1st protests, which, as far as I believe, they hold them every year. This is July 1st was when the Hong Kong was given back to China in 1997. And around 2003, 2004, these protests started to get more traction. You can see people have got banners, placards, lots of things written on signs. That's 2014. There's not that many banners, but there's a huge amount of phones. So we've gone from this moment where people are getting their voice heard by bigger systems, news organizations, TV, whatever was out there. And you think that this is 2014, or 2003, when they were getting their voice heard, they'd been protesting for 6 years at that point. Whereas now, everybody has this thing in their pocket that can put whatever they think, broadcast whatever video they have. It's out there. So they want the news the way they want it. Outlets can still do what the news that they want, but now, crucially, they have their own voice, and they have essentially their own outlet. So their appetite for news, on top of that, changes massively. Who are these people now? How are they consuming news? How do we design for these people? And John Setson, in his talk about designing for the 24-hour experience, people having needs, they have wants, they have dreams, and they have challenges. So if we think about the people, and people have problems, we think about the problem itself. We don't think about this other way to design for a lot of people, which is the persona. We think about something called jobs to be done. So this is a fairly new way of thinking. It's different from personas. We use it quite a lot at The Guardian, with a twist to focus on consumption. And when I say it's new in the sense of the product world. I know a lot of UX researchers and designers that have been talking about jobs to be done for a while. And again, it focuses on solving the problem, not the person or the persona. I'm just going to read this quote out from someone who is a much bigger proponent of jobs to be done than myself or Paul Adams, who I'll be talking about in a moment. People don't buy things because of their demographics. Nobody buys something because they're a 25 to 30-year-old male with a college degree, but rather they go about living their life, and some situations arise in which they need to solve a problem. And so they hire a product to do the job. So some of you may know who Clayton Christensen is. He wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, and he talks about solving the problem, not the person. Now, obviously, The Guardian isn't as much into the conversion market as probably we should be. This is much more about engagement for us. And so our problem solving is reading the news, but we're still about understanding the job. We're not going to design 15 personas for news. We're going to design jobs. So just to continue highlighting the difference on the personas, this is a slide I grabbed from Paul Adams, the VP of Product at Intercom. And so when we're looking at our users, we could have been looking at content problem with personas, right? We could have made it a bunch of different personas, and we just design for those personas. So we go out and talk to people, and we put these people into groups, demographics. We segment these people. We start creating archetypes or stereotypes. And then we design with those people in mind. But with everything changing, it's increasingly hard to say this type of persona is going to meet this type of news or this type of problem. And especially with news becoming 24-hour and becoming so quick to get to market, it's hard for us to segment these people in the same way. Added to that, news is such an unpredictable thing to design for. Take, for instance, what happened yesterday. You can't predict that happening, but it happens. However terrible it is, you still have to provide the news. But you can't say, oh, those people will want this type of thing, or those people will want this type of thing. So just to highlight that, go back to this jobs to be done. Let's say this mother, she's in Germany, and her daughter is going away to college. Maybe she's going to college in a different town. Maybe she's going to college in a different country. We take the person on the right. Let's say she's from Australia. Very different to a German mother. but her friend is at camp. They have the same job. I need to stay in touch. They're radically different people. Potentially, we would have been designing these people as different personas, but they actually just have the same job that we need to design for. So as I said, when it comes to The Guardian, obviously our job is news. News is incredibly unpredictable and covers such a wide, broad set of people. I'm not quite sure if you can still cover all those people with personas. So we look at jobs to be done. So when you think about those new places that are trying news and existing places, if we think about new ones like Facebook, like Twitter, like BuzzFeed, these places have lots of diverse people doing radically different things. A lot of them are actually doing the same things. I need to see what happened last night because I wasn't there. I want to stay in touch with people who are far away. These aren't narrowly categorized to a type of person or an age group or a sex. These can apply to news. These can apply to all number of different things. Big, wide casting nets. So we took the jobs to be done concept, and we created our own version called modes of consumption. So when you think about it, many people, when they're reading the news, will have the same job. They want to just know what's going on. They want to see whether that restaurant is any good. They want to see opinions. They want to see expert advice, points of view. So we went outside the building. We talked to about 1,000 people. And we came up with 3 modes of consumption: update, extend, and discover. Update is all about knowing what's happening right now. I want to feel like I'm connected to what's going on in the world. Think about the last time you unlocked your phone. What was it that you were doing? Were you performing a task? Were you just checking things? Looking at Facebook, looking at Twitter? Were you just actually performing an update? Next is extend. This is when you take the update or the knowing a bit further. So imagine from yesterday, everyone will have immediately got onto Twitter or to Facebook or to whatever platform they needed to get the news from. They would have performed an update. The next day, it's still ongoing. You would go back, you would potentially perform and extend. So I want to gain a deeper understanding of that specific story. What happened? Why did it happen? In things on the web or within your application, you might like stuff, you might comment, you might share things. You extend your sort of deeper understanding. And then finally, the hardest one, discover. I want to be shown something new about the things I'm interested in. So this is when people are bored and they want to get recommended new stuff to look at. Just about everybody in the product business is obviously trying to do some sort of discover. Some people are good at it, some people aren't, some people understand it, some people don't. It's very hard to get right. So if we put those modes of consumptions into a user context, really good thing we often do at The Guardian is we put it into some sort of commute. So when someone is potentially performing an update, they may have a perceived amount of time they expect to spend performing that update. So imagine you're going down onto an underground subway here. You don't have any connection, so you might download a few things quickly, or you might pick stories that you need to get that update from. So what if, this is when we were hypothesizing ideas, what if the problem around displaying that content has nothing to do with the design itself? What if it's around the time that users expect to spend? And how much time they expect to spend when using Guardian products? So we can start thinking about speed, ease of use, envelope it all into time, and design for time. So if we add time to those modes of consumption, extend potentially would have slightly more, and discover has the most. So adding time to our concept dramatically changed our perspective on how we started to think about designing content. So we took this out of the building again. We didn't talk to 1,000 people again, a lot less. And we started to see, could these modes of consumption be operated at different times of the day? And could it affect how much time they think they're expecting to spend? What we found out was, on average, 60 to 70% of people are performing an update. And this isn't specific to The Guardian. This is just any products they're using on their mobile phone. 60 to 70% of people are performing an update. Just getting their phone out, seeing what was going on, putting it back. We went out and did the same thing with just The Guardian. And we found a lot of our content gets looked at the morning after. And people aren't necessarily performing an update, but we really struggle in that market because we're famously long reads. We do lots of detailed, in-depth analysis. A lot of people are going elsewhere for their update, and they're coming to us afterwards. So we would look a bit more like this. Not quite where we want to be. So we want to up that moment. We want to get that update in our control. So at that time, the web team was around 20 to 25 people. We took a team of 5 into a separate room for a month, and we started to think about those problems, those update extend problems, people being able to get those different needs, and also the concept of time. And we sketched a ton. We were thinking about presentation, layout, size, and thinking about the modes of consumption and time. And we struck a chord pretty quickly between this concept of fast journalism and slow journalism. Content at a glance. So being able to easily differentiate things by how they looked. I love this. This was, I'm going to plug this again. This wasn't me. This was my boss again. He loves this, this graph. So that satisfaction of the page with this concept and this perceived time and effort they expect to spend. Fast and slow journalism sits in here. That presentation of variety of content. So just to clarify, fast journalism is simple looking, it's easy and quick to scan, and it's super news focused. It's basically headlines. So this is intentionally designed in a certain way so that you do not spend much time looking over this. You get your quick update and you're gone. On the theory that this is the least amount of time you expect to spend when you're performing. So we go. Very good. So this is the US news front. Obviously, we had to use an image for impact because it was a pretty terrible story. As you scroll down the page, we've only got one image, mostly text. Short amounts of text, short amounts of text. When you think about slow journalism, this is in theory the complete opposite. This is visually rich, much larger, much more colorful, much more indulgent. And so we came up with something called highlights, which is a broad mixture of everything else that sits on the site. And we took that concept even further to what we called the single item container, which is this fantastic shark. And this was something that would break all the rules, but allow us to have maximum impact. So once we had this concept of slow journalism and fast journalism, we took all those people that we talked to previously, and we started bombarding them with emails, prototypes, over a 2-week period to see if our concepts are going in the right way. It was important for us to validate really quickly because we're talking about the front page of our website and the front pages of our sections. These have, to us, they're very important. They still have high traffic. We want to make sure we're validating things properly. So here's one example. We had these big, colorful, slow news pieces above the masthead, our nice, fast news, and then our in-depth. We were still working on the name at that point of highlights. This is something it felt like it was getting a bit closer to what we were trying to do. Obviously, as you can see, when we were hoping to do lots of fast news but less impact, Israel decided to have ceasefires with Gaza and then not. So it was very hard to give tests out to people and expect to get results where they wouldn't just say that news story isn't big enough for the impact of the news that it is. And then below we have the editorial picks. So we took this news container that we had on the front page and we essentially split it in two. So our news-focused headlines and our non-news-focused highlights. So our container ship was much happier, it wasn't on fire. And this is pretty much where we got to. This is just after launch, so these are the headlines. You scroll straight into highlights, much more color, much more impact. We then have sport, only one image for impact. Opinion, a single item container to break that sort of mold. And so, in conclusion, when we were thinking about users and time and dramatically shifting our focus to design for those behaviors, we thought about the person, the reading, the context. We thought about people problems, not personas, and accepting that making big changes can be upsetting. And sometimes you just have to take those bigger steps back and include and discuss and have more of a sort of creative concept, I suppose, before you deep dive into solutions. So overall, I think thinking about the content first for us was much more of a bigger step forward, but we had to take that big step back to accept we weren't getting it quite right. We admitted our mistakes. Sometimes designing your way out of the problem won't help you solve it. Again, not designing for optimizing, designing for content. Thank you.